Today's conversation, as you probably gathered from the description, will feature the leaders of two Nobel Peace Prize-winning humanitarian disarmament campaigns. I also want to mention that tomorrow, at the same time, same place, we'll continue the discussion with coordinators of other campaigns who are working to strengthen or create new international law on fully autonomous weapons, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, the arms trade, and the environmental impacts of war. So if you're free, I encourage you to come back tomorrow. And finally, I want to note that this conference is significant because it launches the new Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative, which is part of the Human Rights Clinic I mentioned before. Our goal is to reduce the harm caused by armed conflict through targeted advocacy, leadership development, and the generation of innovative solutions. And it will engage students in all aspects of this work. So for those of you who are students, I encourage you to come talk to me, and we have brochures at the ends of the tables. So now, to turn to our panelists, I have two very distinguished guests with me. Steve Goose, who's Executive Director of the Human Rights Watch's ARM Division, and he and Human Rights Watch co-founded the international campaign to ban landmines, which revolutionized the field of disarmament and which received the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize for its role in achieving a ban on anti-personnel landmines. Steve also played a critical role in bringing about the 1995 Protocol on blinding lasers and the 2008 Convention banning cluster munitions. Currently, Steve is active in new humanitarian disarmament campaigns, including those striving preemptively to prohibit fully autonomous weapons and to limit the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Beatrice Fihn is Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, known as ICAN, which works to both prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons, and which drove the process that produced the treaty banning these weapons last summer. Under Beatrice's leadership, ICAN received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for drawing attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and for achieving the nuclear weapon ban treaty. Previously, Beatrice managed the disarmament program at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and worked on the Reaching Critical Will project. She also worked for the Geneva Center for Security Policy and has a law degree from the University of London. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to you, and I'd like to ask both of you, how would you define humanitarian disarmament? You can think of it as a movement, a process, a body of law, but I'd be interested to get your ideas for people who are new to the concept. So Steve, I'll start with you.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. We spent 3 hours on this morning in a small group of about a couple of dozen people describing this. Essentially, humanitarian disarmament is characterized by a focus on people, on civilians in particular. And it is aimed at the protection of civilians, both during armed conflict and in a post-conflict situation. And the top priority from a humanitarian disarmament perspective, is the impact on civilians. It's not some regional military balance. It's not some other narrowly conceived national security interest or perceived national security interest. It's making sure that civilians are not harmed unduly from armed conflict or the detritus of armed conflict. And that's a wholesale change in the way that people go about thinking of weapons-related work. And it's one that has not made the militaries terribly happy when you first start getting into it, because they don't want to have any weapon taken away. But we've seen with the process of humanitarian disarmament that once you've got a treaty in place, banning anti-personnel landmines or banning cluster munitions, eventually banning nuclear weapons, the military's got to come to believe that, in fact, this was to their advantage as well, because they're not being blown up, they're not having to demine, things like this. So this is a fundamental restructuring of the way you approach weapons and their impact on civilians.
Beatrice, the same question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything Steve just said. I think it's very much focused on people, and focused on not so much on what protects the state, but what protects people and the impact of that specific weapons have on individuals. And it's an issue that I think follows a lot of other changes in our society that has happened. Humanitarian law, for example, that is more general, and this is just then turning the specific weapons policies in line with that, not targeting civilians, for example. And for nuclear weapons, I mean, that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to wipe out entire cities. It doesn't make any sense to keep them legal. So I think that this kind of movement on humanitarian disarmament uses law and norms to change behavior and make sure that we make a shift as an international community from treating the state security as the only thing that matters to actually looking at the impact on people and protecting people.
Excellent. So
humanitarian disarmament is also quite notable for the way the business is conducted. It's not the usual way that you see international security or diplomacy conducted. First and foremost, maybe because you see civil society, non-governmental organizations and other aspects of civil society driving the process. First, identifying the need. Everybody at one point in time thought that anti-personnel landmines were just something that had to exist. You had more than 120 countries who had stockpiles of these things. They were being used by the millions each year. Seemed like the only normal thing. But civil society said, no, this is unacceptable. You can't have 20,000 people being killed, more than 20,000 people being killed and injured by these things every year. And it was civil society that managed to get the issue onto the international agenda and then managed to push governments to come together and review the situation with landmines. So you've got civil society driving the process. And then eventually, at first, of course, we worked in great opposition to militaries and to governments, but we got to the place where we were able to identify some progressive governments who were seeing things the same way that we were. And it became a partnership, a very active, both strategic and tactical partnership between NGOs, who were all part of the international campaign to ban landmines, and a core group of governments. Started out about 6, grew to a dozen or more, who we spoke to every day, who we conspired with to figure out the right way to make a ban on anti-personnel mines come about. So it was a partnership of civil society, progressive governments, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the sort of arbiter of international humanitarian law, as well as various UN agencies. In the case of landmines, most notably UNICEF, who we worked with extremely closely to make the UN system come around on this issue as well. So this partnership was really responsible for bringing about the treaty that banned anti-personnel landmines. It was the ICBL, International Campaign to Ban Landmines, that got the Nobel Peace Prize, but we were always convinced that it was the joint effort that made the difference. And that probably sounds familiar to Bea as well.
Absolutely.
So building on your discussion about sort of how it originated, you've also been involved with the field for the 20 years since then. How have you seen it evolve, both leading to the Convention on Cluster Munitions and even beyond that?
Well, once we got the ban on landmines, which took an awful lot of intense work, and at one point in time everybody said was pie in the sky, impossible to do, nothing that could ever come about. After we finally did it, people said, oh, actually it wasn't that hard because nobody really liked anti-personnel landmines, and they're antiquated, and militaries didn't really want them anymore, although they were very busy investing in high-tech landmines at the time. And so it was easy to do, and it was a one-off. It was the circumstances at the time that allowed it to happen, and it will never happen again. Well, 10 years later, we had a treaty banning cluster munitions, which in some ways were worse than anti-personnel mines, because cluster bombs are big things that drop out of aircraft or shot out of artillery or out of mortars or other things that burst open in the air and spread out over a very wide area, bigger than a football field. And they do so indiscriminately, killing and injuring civilians in the landing area without doubt. And then a lot of them didn't explode on when they were supposed to, and so they became little landmines laying around, still taking lives and limbs for years and even decades to come, as we see in places like Laos. And we employed the same kind of approach, bringing NGOs together to form a coalition, the Cluster Munition Coalition, that again identified progressive governments to work with, many of the same ones as on landmines, and the ICRC and again UN agencies, working for a common goal to make this happen. was in some ways more difficult than landmines because cluster munitions were so prevalent in fighting forces and were a bigger part of existing war plans even than anti-personnel mines were. But by focusing on a catchphrase, let's ban cluster munitions that cause unacceptable harm to civilians. And who can argue against wanting to ban something that causes unacceptable harm to civilians? So then it became a debate about what's unacceptable harm and what's good and what's bad. But by using much the same approach and methodology, we were able to bring about the ban on cluster munitions in 2008. And then immediately you started hearing, well, you got those too, but that's going to be the end of it, right? People are worried about the slippery slope. But we've seen nuclear weapons come about. There are other campaigns, coalitions in the works on things like killer robots and explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. The arms trade treaty that's been in existence for 5 years now drew a lot of these same lessons and approaches. So it now has become the sort of normal way to do business. In fact, if you look at the last 2 decades, the only time you've had success in dealing with weapons-related issues, the only time you've had success in dealing with arms control and disarmament issues has been through this humanitarian disarmament approach. It's the only way to get things done now, and that's a good thing.
So Beatrice, fast forwarding to last year and the years between the adoption of the Convention on Cluster Munitions and the ban on nuclear weapons, can you talk a little about how the humanitarian disarmament approach influenced that process?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think what Steve said is sort of showing the examples of when this has been done before, and we listened to that in ICANN very carefully. And ICANN was in many ways modeled after ICBL. And created because there was a lack of coordinated efforts. There was no lack of NGOs working on nuclear disarmament, but there was a very spread out in different ways. Some people worked a little bit on testing, some on reduction, some worked in many different contexts. So trying to sort of learn on how to coordinate civil society and how to unify, make one big push. And that's how the idea of prohibiting nuclear weapons, even without the nuclear armed states on board, kind of grew up. That we've seen from the bans on landmines and cluster munitions that even without countries like the United States and Russia formally on board, it still has an impact. It shifts behavior. And also looking back to the history of work on nuclear weapons, the moments when we've had the most success has been because of the humanitarian impacts. They might not have been defined in that way, but the partial test ban treaty, for example, was because people discovered that nuclear testing in the atmosphere impacted people far away from the ground, their own children. And suddenly, that becomes an issue of security. We're testing these weapons that are supposed to protect us, but my kid is being impacted. Same thing with the CTBT that had a huge environmental, nuclear testing in the Pacific, for example, with huge environmental impact. So these kind of arguments have always driven progress. Mm-hmm. And we kind of had that in the nuclear weapons before. We just didn't define it in the same way. So it was quite an easy decision to keep that focus and to really lift up again the voices of survivors, for example, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also from nuclear test areas, and see the people that have had this impact. And to work with this group of governments that wanted to do something about nuclear weapons, look at international humanitarian law and say, like I mentioned before, you're supposed to protect civilians in conflict, not wipe them out completely. It doesn't make any sense that nuclear weapons weren't prohibited. And that's where we kind of started this new approach. And it was the first time also in the nuclear weapons field that anyone tried to do something that wasn't sort of pre-approved by the nuclear armed states. They have very much been having the control over all the discussions. When they wanted to move, things moved. When they didn't, nothing did. And that was really also one of the big lessons we learned, that a group of committed governments together with civil society could push forward something and force them react. And it's quite interesting to hear Steve just talk about, the cluster munitions campaign leading to a debate, what is unacceptable harm? trying to push this conversation when they have to admit, when are you supposed to use nuclear weapons, for example? Under what circumstances would you actually level an entire city and still be in compliance with the IHL? These countries that are allies to the United States and UK and France in NATO, for example, are they happy to admit to their publics that they are involved in the plans and preparations to indiscriminately mass murder hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of civilians? It's quite an uncomfortable question suddenly. So trying to sort of force the conversation where we are strong in civil society, not debate with the sort of security policy experts on whether or not deterrence works for decades. I mean, it's hopeless. But talk about the humanitarian impacts. And of course, people said, well, landmines and customers, that was different. It's never going to work. 1 year ago, exactly just 1 year ago, I was at a DC conference on arms control and nuclear weapons. And there was about 600 participants from this sort of arms control experts, the people who know the most about nuclear weapons. And we had this fancy conference app. And they had a session about you could vote. And one of the questions was, it's a biannual conference, so the next one will be in 2019. By 2019, will there be a ban on nuclear weapons? And I think about 90% said no. And it was just, what? We were 1 week ahead of the start of the negotiations at that point. And it was just kind of like, it's never going to happen because they are not involved. The people in power say that because they are not involved. And I think that we see that very much in other issues as well. The people in power with no interest in changing things are always going to dismiss and ignore it until it happens. And then it was probably their idea from the beginning, and it was totally easy.
So maybe you could.
That happens.
Yeah, it does happen.
Revision to history.
Yeah.
Could you flesh out a little more about sort of what the process, because not everyone will know about how it was came from the humanitarian initiative to the UN, and what finally persuaded states to listen to the humanitarian motivations rather than to the arguments of nuclear armed states?
Yeah, I think it started with this kind of emergence from, I think states came out of the cluster munitions work, really seeing that this is something that works. And the Norwegian government, who was a leader of the cluster munitions process, decided to organize a conference in Oslo in 2013 about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And it was an expert meeting, so there was no real sort of political aim with the meeting officially. I mean, it was for us. But to really just look at what happens if a nuclear weapons goes off, what would the impact be for people? And that kind of built this feeling among states that just shifting the way we talk about the weapon and who gets to talk about the weapon. And it was, instead of having these people that talk about strategic balance between the United States and Russia, for example, you had the ICRC or the UN humanitarian agencies talking about the practicalities of this responding. And it becomes so bizarre when you have a conversation about nuclear weapons from that perspective. For example, in the United Kingdom, there's like 3 or 4 radiation treatment places for 3 or 4 people at the same time. So if there was a nuclear bomb in the UK, what would you do with all the people that needs treatment for radiation disease? What would you do with all the bodies in a big city? New York, for example. What would you do with all the bodies that need to be burned quickly? I mean, it's become such bizarre thinking that you can only, well, we have to make sure that this doesn't happen. But we know that as long as nuclear weapons exist, if they exist forever, they will be used. So it kind of triggered people to really take action. And we also worked a lot with mobilizing non-nuclear armed states. That this was not an issue just for 9 states. This is an issue that, just like climate change, nuclear war would impact all of us. It will not confine to Washington and Moscow. It will impact people everywhere. So everyone has a right to have a say in this. And I think that was really what was unique from this in the nuclear weapons field, is to use the humanitarian disarmament kind of method to really mobilize all states. Because at the end of the day, there's only 9 states with nuclear weapons. It's a very small group of states. There might be big states and rich states, but there are very few of them. The majority of states in the world have rejected these weapons already. And maybe that's where the leadership should be. Not wait for the worst ones to suddenly start leading, but actually mobilize those that are already supportive of us and make sure that there's a clear rejection in the international community. So obviously we work with governments, and more governments came on board. Took a lot of convincing, a lot of hard work, in particular to convince them that this would be meaningful and useful and lead to change, even without them on board first. We didn't wait for the smokers to stop smoking before we banned smoking inside. It was the non-smokers who said, well, fine, keep smoking, but you go outside in the cold. It's a little bit the same method. You know, they have to now go out in the cold. International law will say that these weapons are prohibited. And they might not sign it immediately. But they will have to stand outside in this sort of shameful. We got a resolution through the UN General Assembly that set up negotiations in 2016. Negotiations started in March 2017, concluded July last year, with over 120 countries voting in favor of adopting a treaty that clearly prohibits the use, possession, development, assistance with those kind of acts.
I just sort of, it's worth mentioning, I guess, that landmines and cluster munitions were both conducted, those negotiations were both conducted outside of the UN. They started inside the UN at something called the Convention on Conventional Weapons. Very smart name, huh? The Convention on Convention, it's a Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And they failed. They failed to address the issues adequately. And so a small group of governments took it outside of the UN and took it upon themselves to organize negotiating sessions. And then once they reached agreement and states first adopted and then signed these conventions, it went back into the UN. The UN Secretary General is the depository for them, and the UN structure services those agreements. So we've shown it can be done both outside the UN and inside the UN, depending on which one's going to work more effectively.
Right, and in all three of these cases, clusters, landmines, and nuclear weapons, the end result has been a treaty. The first two have all been adopted by more than, or not adopted, ratified or acceded to by more than 100 states. As you mentioned, 122 countries voted in favor of the nuclear ban treaty. So in that sense, the humanitarian perspective has affected the content of the norms. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what are the characteristics of a humanitarian disarmament treaty, at least using these three as examples. So Beatrice, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's each issue is different, of course, and is negotiated in a different context, a different time, with different leading countries and different opponents. But they do have something in common. I mean, these three treaties, of course, prohibit the weapon straightforwardly. It's not trying to control them or reduce them. It outright prohibits them. I think that's very helpful in a normative, if you want to build a norm. It needs to be clear and straightforward, and in a simple way so that people can understand yes or no to this weapon. I think one of the problems with nuclear weapons and the way we've tried to address nuclear weapons before is we try to do the same, both at the same time. They are bad, so we need to do something about it, but they're also good and useful for some states, so we need to keep them, and we can't really reject them. So the sort of clear-cut rejection of the weapon, I think, is really key. Other things that have been really important is, of course, the underlying reason, the humanitarian concerns, clearly reference making sure that there's provisions for helping victims of these weapons, victim assistance, for example. And of course, a way to eliminate these weapons, a requirement that they're not just prohibited, but you also have to eliminate them.
Excellent. And Steve, do you have anything to add from
I mean, those same sort of elements were present in the landmine ban treaty and the cluster munition ban treaty. You have the comprehensive prohibition, no production, no transfer, no use. There's a requirement to destroy all of your stockpiles, which is not true of all arms control or disarmament agreements, and to do so within a deadline. So it's not just you can do it over the course of the next 100 years, but you have to do it in a quite short period of time. And then there are these remedial aspects to it. It's sort of a holistic approach is one way that it has been described. You don't just stop more being used or more being produced, but you try to take care of the problem that already exists. So there are requirements to clear anti-personnel mines and to clear cluster munition remnants, unexploded submunitions that I was talking about that can act just like anti-personnel mines. And you have to do that within a time frame as well. There's a legal deadline by which you have to accomplish that. And then there was, in the Landmine Treaty, the first time you had a victim assistance article that said that states parties in a position to do so were supposed to assist the victims of the weapon. First time that had ever happened. And then that was elaborated on greatly in the Convention on Cluster Munitions with more specific obligations, and that has become now a really extremely well-developed aspect of this work, the assistance to the victims of the weapon. So we never expected that to show up in the Landmine Treaty. It actually entered fairly late in the negotiations. Started out as just the ban, and then at one point in time we added in the clearance obligation, which we thought was incredible in and of itself, and then just a few months before the negotiations started, we were able to add in provision dealing with victim assistance. So it's quite an amazing, those are quite amazing treaties that have all of these aspects that are included and that are being implemented, that are being obeyed by all the states parties and many of the countries who are not even party to the treaty. Like the United States. The United States is one of the biggest funders for clearance and for victim assistance of landmines and cluster munitions, even though they still have yet to sign either treaty.
I think it's just really interesting to see also how the law progressively develops. As Steve said, you know, the Landmine Treaty had a victim assistance clause that was then developed in the cluster munitions further. You had the arms trade treaty, you had a gendered impact of arms trade provision, which was also elaborated further in the nuclear ban treaty with both impact of nuclear weapons on women and children, and also the importance of participation of women in these discussions. And of course, also in the nuclear ban treaty, we added environmental impact in the treaty. So, you know, far from being, these treaties are of course never perfect because you have to deal with a lot of governments, and governments are very difficult sometimes. But you can see sort of a progressive development of the law as well, and how it sort of, each of them sets some kind of benchmark as well for future legal instruments, which I think is really interesting. So it's definitely a part of a growing way of dealing with this issue, and how you have to include more and more issues in consideration.
And also moving from conventional weapons to weapons of mass destruction, another way, applying the same norms to new types of weapons.
Yeah. And by the way, Bonnie's done the best writing on the legal aspects of these treaties and how they have built upon one another. She's asking us the questions, but she knows all the answers better than we do.
Just working on my next article. So obviously we talked a lot about the norms, and you mentioned implementation. I was wondering if you could expand on how these treaties have actually made a difference in people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people think that getting a treaty signed is the big deal. And of course it is. It's a huge deal and takes an incredible amount of work. But the harder thing is making sure that they're obeyed and that they're implemented properly. That's not the sexy part. That's the hard work part. And that's what takes even longer. I mean, we were able to get the treaty on landmines in about 5 years. And once we got serious about cluster munitions, got that one in about 5 years. You heard Beatrice say they got the one on nukes in 2 weeks. So once they got past the 90% saying it will never be done. So, you know, I'm sorry, I've lost myself here, Bonnie.
Implementation.
Implementation. So the implementation is the longer term task, as well as universalizing, getting everybody in the world to sign up. Huge task for the nuclear weapons ban. But it has been a huge success for both landmines and cluster munitions because they have been obeyed so well. There have been more than 50 million anti-personnel landmines destroyed from stockpiles. We now have about 30 countries that have cleared all of the landmines from their territory, including recently countries like Mozambique, that at one point in time were the most heavily affected countries out there. So you've seen lives and limbs saved probably in the tens of thousands, maybe the hundreds of thousands, because each mine from stocks that's destroyed will never take a life or a limb. The land has been cleared and returned to productive use. One of the horrible things about landmines and cluster munitions is that they don't just kill and injure people, but they take away the livelihood as well and prevent reconstruction after conflict. And you now see country after country that's able to return land to productive use. And it's made a huge difference in Cambodia and many other places. So you still have sometimes people say, well, what difference does this treaty make because the US hasn't signed it and Russia hasn't signed it and China hasn't signed it? And you say, well, ask those affected countries if it's made a difference. So it not only has created a new way of doing international relations, a new way of approaching international security, but it's really making a difference in people's lives.
And so I'm sure I know you've heard the argument, well, the nuclear armed states aren't on board with this treaty yet. What do you hope the difference the nuclear ban treaty will make?
I think both in a kind of normative way and stigmatizing nuclear weapons. It's been far too easy for the nuclear armed states to keep their nuclear arsenals up until now. The rest of the world, we've just accepted somehow that nuclear weapons are exempt from all reason, laws, norms. You wouldn't see them bragging about their right to, kill civilians with any other weapon. But with nuclear weapons, somehow that's fine. It's been treated very much like a sterile, theoretical issue, a power tool rather than a real weapon that actually blows up things. So I think that one of the main points of this treaty, of course, to treat nuclear weapons as a weapon and to kind of expose the weapon for what it is, a huge, really dirty bomb that is meant to just kill as many civilians as quickly as possible, and to poison those that survive so that they will live a life with suffering and pain. I mean, that's what they are. They're not tools of national pride. They're not symbols of being a big power. They're just really awful weapons. So I think that's one of the things. But of course, there's also very practical. The rest of the world, even if they don't have nuclear weapons, we are still participating in a lot of activities around these weapons. First of all, the military allies of nuclear armed states that are involved in the plans and preparations. Some of them have nuclear weapons stationed on their territory. Some of them their militaries are participating in them, or just help with targeting of nuclear weapons. That's also being a part of the problem. Our banks are still financing the production of these weapons. We see now with comments from Trump and Putin, Kim Jong-un, a new nuclear arms race. And someone is profiting of this. One day the bomb will go off, and there's some people are profiting of that, keeping that option open. So I think that's also very, this treaty could or is already leading to stronger demands on financial institutions and banks, for example, to divest from production. And we've seen that in the cluster munitions context, for example, being an effective way to get arms companies to stop producing the weapon that is prohibited. It's not a good investment strategy to keep investing in a weapon that the rest of the world is prohibiting. It's going out of style. It's going out of fashion. It's going to be a burden for your company rather than a profit. And in one way, companies are better than governments in that way because they take more rational decisions sometimes. And of course, the victim assistance. There's huge environmental and humanitarian impact around the world, both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the nuclear test sites, where the nuclear armed states mostly on colonies, indigenous people's land. There's a lot of racism in this issue as well, where you test nuclear weapons. They don't test it close to Washington. They test it on indigenous people's land, or colonies like the Marshall Islands, or the French tested in the Pacific, or in Algeria, Soviet tested in Kazakhstan. These, people that they thought were less worth, or that they didn't even consider them people at the time. And these communities are now having a huge amount of problems, diseases, difficulties. They've been displaced. And this treaty provides for to set up international assistance to help those. And people can criticize this treaty because the nuclear armed states isn't on board. But if that this treaty helps one person, I'd say it was worth it.
Makes sense. So we talked about earlier about civil society being the driver behind all three of these treaties. And I guess first of all, I'd ask, why do you think civil society has been able to be so influential in these approaches to international law?
Well, for a whole range of reasons. And it took a long time for that to develop, well, years for it to develop, not decades, but years for it to develop. A big part of it, going back to landmines initially, and this was also true for cluster munitions, we held the information. We had the knowledge base. We were able to do the research on the ground that demonstrated the harm that these weapons were causing. We also had the best information about stockpiling and use. When we first started reporting on landmines, governments were like, well, how did you know that? And this is stuff we've never seen before. So it was being able to educate the governments. They looked to us as experts on the subject. It's probably a trickier thing with nukes, where they think if you don't know about throw weights, then you're nobody. But with landmines and cluster munitions, we were able to demonstrate that we knew more than they did, and that they needed our information to understand the issue. So that's kind of the knowledge part of it, but we also were incredible advocates, starting with using those who've been affected by the weapon to be a strong voice. The survivors of landmines and cluster munitions were our most effective advocates. They were the ones who could really make the governments stop, take a pause, and think about what this really meant around the world. So it was the combination of being really good in terms of the knowledge base and research with very effective advocacy. And it gets back to this partnership as well, where you had governments who believed that they could trust us. And that's not always the case between governments and civil society, governments and non-governmental organizations. We did spend years kind of kicking at the shins of governments, but then once we convinced them that this was something that had to happen, we came to view each other as extremely trustworthy. And it was a leap of faith for both sides. There were a lot of people in the landmine campaign who thought we were crazy to start embracing governments instead of just acting strictly in an antagonistic mode toward them. But we found that there were lots of people inside governments who were better campaigners than a lot of our campaigners, who had just as much invested, who felt just as strongly as we did, and who were just as committed to a comprehensive ban. And so that gave the heat to the partnership and allowed us to be so effective.
Anything to add on that from your perspective?
Yeah, just think a little bit wider about what it is that we're doing really in civil society. And I think it's really about channeling public opinion and public pressure. I think we need to remember that governments work for us, and we get to decide what they do on our behalf. And it doesn't feel like that all the time. And it feels quite difficult to change governments' minds. But at the end of the day, the people decide. So I think that it's obviously international treaty making and international relations. Governments have been quite comfortable not having a lot of public scrutiny there. And civil society's role is, of course, also to represent people. Democracy is not just about voting. It's also because it's very difficult, in particular today, for an individual to be so fully informed about all the issues, knowing, landmine stockpile issues or knowing nuclear weapons targeting information. It's impossible for a public to know all these things. So we need NGOs and civil society organizations that have the time and the resources to develop their expertise and holding these government accountable. And I think it's, in particular today, when there is so much information, so much misinformation, and different sort of interpretation of facts, very, very important to have strong civil society actors. So I think that civil society is just going to increase in influence in more and more every year. I think that we're going to play an even stronger role in holding the governments accountable and to make sure that they answer the questions that we have, that they their decisions and their policies aren't just being made and then never questioned, but that we really, really know what they are. So, I mean, just looking at and you don't have to be that big of an expert to be able to do that. I mean, just looking at the people that are a part of the ICANN, it's not heads of states or, it's not celebrities or anything like that. It's just a bunch of regular people that got together and organized to change something. And that is really, I mean, no matter how we explain the process, that's really what is changing the world at any point, people demanding change. It's very rarely the government themselves. It's not a president or a prime minister. It's like, oh yeah, let's develop some new laws. Let's just do some stuff here to change things for better. It suits them the way it is. So it will only come from people demanding the change, not the people at the top, but regular people.
Yeah, I definitely got that sense. I had the honor to be with you at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, and there was definitely this feeling, these ordinary people changing the world. And I was wondering if you could talk then conversely how the Nobel Peace Prize has helped or benefited both your individual campaigns, but also the movement more broadly.
Yeah, I think it changes everything and nothing at the same time, in a way. It's obviously, I mean, an enormous honor for the campaign. And it was so great to see. I mean, it's really hard work. It's tiring work. It's very underfunded. It is frustrating. You have to face, these stupid people that won't listen to you, like, every day. So, at times it feels really hopeless. You watch Donald Trump's tweet, or Putin says this, and, it feels like, you just spend all this time and energy. And then to get this kind of recognition was a huge mobilizer and energizer for the whole campaign. And it was so overwhelming to see also how it was celebrated. I think about 10, 15 cities claimed it as their prize. It was in Melbourne where the campaign was started. It was Vienna where the campaign was launched. It was Oslo where it happened. Geneva where we're based. Everywhere. And I think that's really a beautiful sort of testament to how global the campaign is. And to see, I saw on social media the day after, and just seeing, all the campaigners from all corners of the world, from Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, all over, celebrate, and, we won the Nobel Peace Prize. So it was extremely great. It has lifted up the issue, in a way. In media, we get a lot more recognition, a lot more invitations to conferences and stuff like that. More meetings, which is really nice. It's, so it has that kind of direct impact. But of course, the politics of the issue is still the same. And that's, it doesn't change fast. I feel like, especially on the nuclear weapons issue, the nuclear weapons is sort of like a religion to people. And I had spent some time earlier this week to talk to some American gun control activists. There's some similarities there, like, facts and reason says this is a bad idea. You will get hurt yourself. This is really bad for you. But people feel safe with these weapons. So it's almost like an indoctrination. And it will require a lot of picking apart the arguments, the emotions we attach to these weapons in order to make progress. So they're obviously not going to be a direct impact that suddenly we get the Nobel Peace Prize, the United States government is like, all right, we'll give them up. I mean, it's not going to work like that. But it will help us start picking these and getting the opportunities to speak to the people that will really, really matter and change this, and that's people.
Steve, how did that impact ICBL, but also some of those earlier campaigns?
Sort of a lot of the same kinds of things, but I mean, one of the things we point to is this immediate impact that it had. The Landmine treaty was negotiated in September of 1997, and a little over 80 countries adopted the negotiated text in September. In October, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to ICBL. And then the first week in December, 122 countries signed. So we went from 80 some odd up to 122 in the course of just a little over a month. And that was all due to the Peace Prize. We didn't have a sudden fit of advocacy that caused that to happen. It was because people thought that the Peace Prize legitimized banning anti-personnel landmines. And in a lot of states who were on the sort of on the fence about whether or not to join, decided this would be a pretty good idea, because we're going to look silly if we don't go along with the treaty that just got the Nobel Peace Prize. So that was, to us in many ways, the biggest and best impact. And we now have more than 160. I guess we're 164 now with Sri Lanka having come on board. So it continues to grow, and the Peace Prize, I think, still has an impact to this day. It has a practical thing, like, before the Peace Prize, you'd go to meet a government and you'd talk to the third political secretary, and then suddenly you're meeting with foreign ministers. And ambassadors want to come shake your hand. And so it has that way of raising the level of access that you have, which then has the effect of helping to change policies. So that was also, I think, extremely important. And it still has an impact to this day. Amelie, how does every ICBL press release start? The Nobel Peace Prize-winning ICBL says, and so you get a very long-term value from it.
Excellent. So I'd like to, I think we have mics. Someone know if we have mics, but open it up to questions. If anyone in the audience has questions. Yes, go ahead.
Could you comment on the disjuncture or I guess pointing out the road we still have to go or something, like using the Yemen conflict as an example? Like, I believe U.S. anti-personnel weapons and some cluster munitions, as well as conventional bombs, are all being supplied by the U.S. to the forces that are using them in Yemen.
Yeah. The Saudi-led coalition has been using U.S. cluster munitions in Yemen. They've not used anti-personnel landmines. Some of the Houthi forces on the ground have used landmines in Yemen. The U.S. cut off cluster munition sales under the Obama administration, cut off cluster munition sales and deliveries to Saudi Arabia because they were using them in populated areas, and it's against U.S. export law to use cluster munitions in populated areas. It's unclear if this administration is going to keep that policy in place. So the U.S. doesn't have a good position on cluster munitions, but it's got some aspects that are positive. Saudi Arabia has taken a lot of heat for the coalition, and we don't know if it's just Saudi Arabia, could be others as well, using. So the norm that we talk about, the standard setting, is having an impact. Saudi Arabia is not saying, sort of touting the fact that it's using them. It's saying we're only using the most advanced ones, and we're using them very carefully. So.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could speak briefly, particularly for the students. Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak briefly, Bonnie, particularly for the students who are in the room, about your and the students who are in your clinics' involvement in the negotiations for the treaty this summer.
Sure. So we, myself and Anna Crow, who's wandering somewhere, who were in the clinic, had a wonderful team of 4 students, some of whom are in the room, who participated in the negotiations, and we tried to provide legal advice to ICANN because they were covering so many different issues. And so we were at the negotiations, the first round in March, and then the 3 weeks of really intense work in June, July. Our focus was on the so-called positive obligations, the victim assistance and environmental remediation articles, and we worked with another group of dedicated advocates from various different organizations to actually successfully get in the treaty what we wanted to get in the treaty, which was really rewarding and hopefully a rewarding experience for the students as well. So it's been...
And it was a long shot, yes?
Yes, some people said it was a long... My understanding is that a year ago, people weren't even talking about these obligations in the context of nuclear weapons. You would know better, Beatrice, but that was what I heard. And that to get all our red lines in, which was amazing, so...
I mean, just to follow up on that, I think we talked about it, the victim assistance with governments in the lead up to negotiations. They're like, no, it's not like cluster munitions. No, it's too complicated, and it's not going to happen. And I think this is just again one of those examples where quite a small group of people. How many were you? 10 in total, maybe?
Something like that, yeah.
10
maybe not even, yeah.
Got that part in the treaty, and it's good. And without those 10 people, that wouldn't be in the treaty. And nagging governments and keeping them updated and showing showing the arguments and counter-arguments and facts. So I think that that's a real example of how powerful civil society can be. If 10 people can get such a significant part in the treaty, I mean, imagine what we can do. So I think that was just such a fantastic work for you and your team and the other ones. And really, without that work, we would not have had any language on victim assistance in the treaty.
It was also, for me personally, interesting to see how across campaigns. So I was working with Steve on the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and to be able to draw lessons from that experience and then apply them to the new context, I think, shows the power of keeping this approach as a broader approach, not campaign-specific. Are there other questions? Yeah, I'm going to go over here, and then we'll come over. But go, yeah, you.
You'd mentioned in the beginning of your speech the importance this impact has on women and children, and also the importance of having women at the table. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, in a nuclear detonation, the people that die no matter what their gender is. But radiation from nuclear weapons impacts women and men differently. Women have more soft tissue than men, so are more prone to take up the radiation and develop more cancer, in particular also for women's reproductive system. We see a lot of research from nuclear test sites in particular, but also from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, women having problems giving birth, stillbirth, lots of miscarriages, which also then includes, I was just in Hiroshima and Nagasaki a few months ago. Some of the survivors talked about how they lied. They didn't want to admit that they were from Hiroshima and Nagasaki because no man wanted to marry them. So the sort of social stigma that comes with that. And then, of course, so that there has and same thing with children. The younger you are at the time of the detonation, the more likely you are to develop cancers or the diseases. So the younger you are, the more exposed you are to the radiation. Which just has an impact, and why we have to look at this weapon also from those groups of people. It's not often those groups of people that sit in the decision-making rooms when you decide whether or not to drop these bombs or not. And that's why it's important to raise this. And in terms of the women's participation in nuclear weapons, we talked quite a lot about it, about sort of the gendered dynamics around this weapon. And some people think that, it's a bit of a far-stretched argument. And then Trump tweets that my button is bigger than yours. And people are like, oh, yeah, I get it, actually. I see what you're talking about here. But I think that's, again, coming back to who are these weapons meant to protect? And I personally don't think that women are more peaceful than men in general. But I think that we all, due to structures in society, have different roles in society as well. And women are often given a caretaking role, rebuilding communities and families after warfare. And we've seen that also been very well proved in peace negotiations, because of the different roles in society we have, if you include women, the peace lasts longer. Just practical things about what do you do with the weapons afterwards? Do you let men who are traumatized from warfare bring it home to their families, and what that can trigger? So just by involving women, you will have different perspectives on this. It doesn't help to have one woman in power. And I think we've seen that, of course, there's nuclear armed states where there's a female, leader. It doesn't work like you just put a woman in the position and then magically. Because I also think that it's very much about what we define as strength, and sort of this idea that taking what we want by force and getting what we want by forcing it or threatening to get it is masculine and therefore has sort of positive connotation, whereas women are taught to negotiate, compromise, diplomacy in a way, and that has sort of a weak negative connotation. So by adding a lot more women in all levels of power, in all conversations, not one woman might not change it, but by having a much more of a diverse conversation about this, you will also start perhaps valuing these things differently. Maybe compromising diplomacy, working to have both parties get something out of it, take and give in a way, could actually be seen then as stronger than just bombing. So that's why I think it's sort of an important aspect to have.
Thanks. There are some questions over here. Yes, yours, sir. You would like. Thank you.
Comparing the humanitarian treaties to the arms control treaties, the question of verifications, inspections, of course, the nuclear ban treaty has been pushed by the non-nuclear countries. How do we deal with this issue of cheating and for a weapon like nuclear weapons that are integral to their military doctrines, they're going to have to be very, very deeply convinced that they're safe before they will give it up.
Yeah, I think that this is also one of the strengths of the humanitarian disarmament kind of framing, is to make the countries want to give up their weapons. I think a big problem for the nuclear weapons arms control agreements is that they're trying to disarm a weapon that they still convinced are essential for your security. So first of all, why? Why do you give up something that's, keeps you safe? It's sort of two inconsistent sort of thoughts at the same time. But then, of course, if you still believe that nuclear weapons keep you safe and it's the most powerful weapon in the world, then it's great and it keeps the world's power balance in check, then of course it's going to be incentive to cheat as well. Whereas if you reframe it and see it as an inhumane, big, giant bomb that just is a threat to ourselves, there's a lot more, you just have a different perspective on it, and you want to get rid of it because you don't actually want to have it. It doesn't mean, of course, that disarmament treaties shouldn't have verification or inspections. The ban treaty includes the same standard of inspections as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so the IAEA inspections. It also provides for stronger, even more intrusive inspections in the future. I assume that when the nuclear armed states will join, they will want to negotiate that kind of things as well. So of course it's important to have verification, but I think we also have to work very much on this sort of fundamental belief that we do not want these weapons.
The Landmine and the Cluster Munition Treaty have no intrusive verification provisions. They operate on what's called cooperative compliance model, where states parties do what they can to help other states parties meet their obligations to destroy their stocks, to clear the contaminated areas. This has worked extremely well. It'd be very easy to cheat on either one of these conventions. I mean, you can build a landmine in your garage quite easily. But the essence of the humanitarian disarmament treaties, the early ones especially, are that you have a like-minded group of states who are joining, even though some are enemies. Greece and Turkey are both part, things like that. But you agree on this issue, that you should adopt this new norm against any use or any possession. And you don't need to have inspections because you don't expect people to cheat. And it's worked extremely well.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for this excellent presentation. And just want to say I'm from Pakistan, which is a nuclear-armed nation, probably the fastest, apparently, growing stockpile. And it has always bothered me as a Pakistani, this conflict, this idea of mutual destruction, mutually assured destruction with India. Now, the argument that one sort of finds oneself up against when one talks to people who are policymakers is that these nuclear weapons have actually stopped wars, conventional war. So because there is a deterrent, there is no conventional war, and Pakistan and India will not go to war. Now, that is probably brinkmanship, but my question is, how do you address that point? I understand the sovereignty and all of those issues, and the chest thumping and everything, but in terms of addressing that basic argument about deterrence, how do you sort of respond to that?
I think this is part of this kind of idea that nuclear weapons are almost like a theoretical exercise, that we kind of debate deterrence theories and does this lead to that. There are many examples where nuclear weapons haven't stopped conflict. We've had nuclear armed states go to have sort of armed conflict with each other. We've had non-nuclear weapon states attacking nuclear armed states, even though they have nuclear weapons. But even if you can sort of say that, oh, sometimes it might work, sometimes it might not. And there's, of course, also the risk of accidents, misunderstandings. Nuclear weapons also fuel crisis. If nuclear weapons prevented war and kept the peace, then why doesn't it feel like peace with North Korea, for example? Why aren't we welcoming North Korea? You know, if they just get nuclear weapons, then everything should be fine. Everyone should have nuclear weapons then. But we also realize, of course, that it's really dangerous, because the more countries that have them, the more likely it is that someone will use them. So I think it's instead of thinking so much about what they prevent or not prevent, we know that the risk of them being used is greater than 0. So that means that given enough time, they will be used. We are right now just waiting for them, you know, for the day when they go off. And it can be by a mistake or an accident. There's been many of them. The more information that comes out from the Cold War now shows how many times we were really, really close to nuclear use. Not just things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but just pure accidents and misunderstandings. A training video that was left in a monitor. And human soldiers who just like disobeyed order because they figured out that something was wrong. An algorithm was on that. So I think it's just what happens then, and what would the impact be then? I think that's the question where we have to put our focus on, not the perceived theoretical consequences, but the real actual consequences of the day that they will be used again, because they will, and who will be harmed, what impact will they have? That's the conversation they should answer. And the nuclear armed states really don't want to answer those questions. They love their weapons, but they don't want to talk about them as weapons. And they absolutely don't want to talk about what they're supposed to use them for, where they're aimed at, what the targets are, how, you know, because then it becomes a real weapon that we can control. It's much better to just keep it sort of abstract, theoretical. They just keep the pace, don't ask any questions. Fine. So that kind of thing. So it's really to break it down to the concrete facts. What happens? They're threatening to use them daily. That means that they are actually prepared to do it. Deterrence wouldn't work if it was false threats. So they have active plans and preparations to use them. And one day, someone who's angry or unstable or by mistake will press the button.
Any other
Angry,
questions?
unstable?
Yeah, right here on the end.
Who's that?
Hi. This is a very broad question, and actually, I think it touches upon the funding question, sort of wrapping them all together. But this is one of the biggest threats we know to civilization, and I wonder why it isn't a larger concern to more individuals. And one of the things that always resonates with me is what you were talking about before as being very theoretical rather than actual. And I'm wondering if we can take advantage of and also closely connect ourselves to the weapons discussion we're having in the country right now about gun violence. Because when I saw the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative, that's one of the things that came to mind first, even though that may not be what we had in mind for this conference, in terms of gathering funding for the issue and also making the issue resonate on a very personal level. So rather than being theoretical, be something that people feel ownership over. You know, you think that guns are a threat to you. How about a nuclear weapon falling on your region? That's clearly a civilian protection issue. And if we can somehow merge those issues together, I think we might have a greater chance of funding and also protection. Have you thought about combining those two in your discussions, or is this something that's a new possibility after this local movement that just started?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a lot of similarities. One of the frustrating thing about working on nuclear weapons is this kind of lack of ability to see it as a weapon, and it's this magic thing that just keeps us safe, and you can't question it. And I think that's because it's almost too big for people to comprehend. And sometimes there's a tendency also from us who work it that if we only convince people about how bad these are, then they will get really involved. But I don't think it works like that. And the way we talk about it is like, you know, it's almost like people think that if nuclear weapons are used, it's just game over. End of the entire civilization, and it's like an astro hits Earth. So that's not very mobilizing, and it doesn't, you just feel like giving up. That it would be an act of God, you know, natural disaster, I can't do anything about it, it just would happen. But I think it's important, that's why again, to bring it back to the concrete, talk about the humanitarian consequences, there will be survivors. If there's a nuclear bomb, that's not the end of the world. I mean, and I don't mean that it's not the end of the world. I mean, that's not actually the end of the world. There will be survivors, and we saw that in Hiroshima, we saw that in Nagasaki. And one of the striking things when you listen to the survivors of those is just really how human it is. They were trying to get water, trying to figure out where their parents were, or where, you know, these kind of just things that people do when there's warfare. And in that way, nuclear weapons aren't that special than any other. It's the same as any weapon. They harm and kill and, you know, injure people very bad, and we need to protect people from that in a way. So I think that the human stories to get people to understand what these weapons are, but with also providing some hope and a feeling that we can do about it is really important. I think that that's what you see also perhaps in this country of gun control right now. A lot of these teenagers are talking about it, and it's really hard to ignore them when people are talking about their own experiences. It's hard to look away and just say, oh, it's for protection, when people talk about exactly how they felt and what they went through. So I think there's definitely a lot of similarities there.
Any more questions? We'll take these two, and then I may have to call time. We'll see where we are. Oh, OK, 3. Go ahead, in the middle there. Somewhere in there.
Somebody somewhere.
Hi. Thank you for being here with us today. My question is directly for Mr. Goose. I know that you work extensively with landmines, and currently I know that the U.S. reserves the right to use landmines to ensure the stability of the 38th parallel between the Koreas. What measures have you taken, and also your organization taken, to dissuade the U.S. from using landmines?
It's been a long haul, trying to get the U.S. on board. At one point in time, before the convention was concluded, we thought we had the U.S. on board. We had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense who had signed off on the U.S. Agreeing to join the treaty. But then a bunch of generals came together, and especially those dealing with Korea, convinced them to hold off. And then the U.S. said that it would join in a number of years, and then that was reversed. But we're in a not bad situation with the U.S. on landmines right now, actually. Under the Obama administration, they implemented a halt to all use of anti-personnel mines except those needed for the Korean Peninsula, which has been held out as the bugaboo. Our take is that Korea may be the place where you least need anti-personnel mines because you have so many other forces, so many other weapon systems that are redundant that can perform the function of anti-personnel mines in terms of slowing forces down or channeling them into killing zones. So many redundant systems that landmines are not needed. And we've had various generals who used to run U.S. and Korean joint forces on the peninsula say they were never a big part of our war plan. I don't know what the story is now. So we've got it to the place where the U.S. is destroying its stockpiles, except for those needed for Korea, has agreed not to use them anywhere except in Korea. So it's just that last little bit that we've got to do. And under the current tense situation regarding the peninsula, it's probably not the best time to be saying remove that Korea exemption right now. But we've been calling for that and laying out the reasons for it. So we've had some success there. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has reversed U.S. policy on cluster munitions. The U.S. was going to ban all but a very small fraction of its cluster munitions as of 2018, as of the end of this year. But the Trump administration has thrown that objective out.
Can I just add something like really just that came to my mind now? Like, if nuclear weapons really deter others, then why even need landmines there? I mean, they have the nuclear weapons that they aim at North Korea. Why would they need these weapons then? Is that an admission that nuclear weapons don't actually deter everything and all this? And, yeah. Sorry.
Interesting, yeah.
Just.
So we have there, sir?
Something about having to use them close to the border, which means everybody in Seoul's going to die too.
Yeah. It's always.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for this. This is a great conference. My name is Matt Bivens. I'm an ER doctor. I'm chair of Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Yeah, excellent.
We have a whole contingent here of physicians who are responsible, international physicians for prevention of nuclear war. So, it's, obviously an issue we care a lot about. Feel a little bit like Red Sox going to Yankee Stadium, coming over to the law school, but it's good.
As long as you're a Red Sox fan, you're welcome.
I had a question about who you feel like, let's say just in the United States, who concretely is standing in the way of nuclear disarmament? And I mean, are there politicians? Are there bureaucrats? Are there corporations? I feel like we say the United States doesn't want this, but it's a pretty diverse country. And in particular, when you see everybody from Obama to George W. Bush say we need to take weapons off of hair trigger alert, but it never happens. Yeah. Colin Powell wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. If you go through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so many of them, as soon as they're out of office, want to get rid of nuclear weapons. So who is blocking this? Is it just inertia? Is it corporate money? That would be my question. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to add too. I forgot. There is a call to step back from the brink that is being organized. I didn't know all about this. But PSR is working on this. We have a document that we are getting people to sign up for. So if people are interested, we have information. We'll have it in the back. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm not the U.S. domestic politics expert. I'm Swedish. But obviously, I think it's quite interesting to see, for example, the U.S. had 8 years of the most progressive president it's ever had on nuclear weapons under Obama. And obviously,
got a Nobel Peace Prize for it.
He got them, exactly. Yes. No, but I think it's also, he wasn't progressive enough for us in even his statements, but the fact that he couldn't even do what he set out to do shows that there is something stopping them, the politicians. And I think it's probably a mix of a lot of different things. Steve mentioned before, the military doesn't like it when you try to take away weapons from them. They just don't like it generally. It doesn't matter if, how inconvenient the weapons actually are. They just rather prefer to have all options open. So that is obviously a big part of it. A lot of its allies, these countries around the world, are also part of the problem. And we know, for example, that Obama wanted to institute a no first use policy and was told by some of its allies, like some of the Eastern European countries in NATO, Japan, do not do that. Do not implement what you said you would do in the NPT. Don't do it. So I think that's also a big problem. And one of the things that this campaign is trying to highlight, this responsibility everyone has for upholding these weapons. Obviously, the military, the companies that produce these weapons, huge contracts. Obama, and now with Trump continuing it and expanding it, is making the biggest investment in nuclear weapons since the Manhattan Project. Huge amount of money taking away from schools, hospitals, all that things that people need into these weapons. So there's of course a lot of interest there. But I think that the main problem is that doing these kind of things is going to be hard for politicians. There's a lot of interest in keeping status quo. It's also a power issue. They want to keep their power, this explosive power. So for politicians, that's always going to be tough. And there has to be negative impact, negative consequences for the politicians if they don't. I think that's how politics work. They will do what's in their interest. People haven't made it in the politicians' interest to move on disarmament so far in some of these countries. And it's because this kind of sense of, I think most people don't like nuclear weapons. It's not something people really like, yay, let's have more of them. But they just don't. Of course, there's some exceptions, but I think that most people agree that it would be better if nobody had them. But channeling that into actual political pressure is the challenge, and trying to get that to be just a sort of a vague wish into something concrete. That is really the issue. So there has to be a lot more consequences for politicians to not do that. And I think that's again what we see on the gun control issue. Like, this movement are growing, trying to actually make that have consequences for politicians. And when that happens, I think we'll see change.
The last question, I think it was in the back row there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was struck when you mentioned earlier the combination of thinking about climate change with nuclear weapons, because they both affect us all. And I'm wondering if there is some way of combining both of these issues, that we need to actually concentrate on protecting ourselves from climate change, and we shouldn't be wasting money on weapons. And is this a good tactic going forward, if we can kind of combine both those issues and try to save the planet in more than one way at the same time?
I mean, it definitely has similar sort of consequences, impact that spreads across the borders. You see that, for example, in these Pacific states that have nothing to do with developing nuclear weapons nor causing climate change, but they've been bombed through the nuclear testing. And now they're being flooded by climate change, and it's sort of that kind of disproportionate impact on them. I think also both issues, if we don't act, we will all suffer. I think that's really important to remember. If we continue the way we do right now on both of those issues, things are going to get bad, very bad, for all of us, no matter where we live. And it's going to have huge impact on economy, on stability in the world, on migration flows, and things like that. So doing nothing is not an option. And I think on the climate change issue, we're starting to understand that. We're obviously not doing enough. But people are starting, even companies, are starting to understand that doing nothing on climate change is not an option. And we need to get that on nuclear weapons as well, and need to really understand that by doing nothing, we accept the use of nuclear weapons along the line. So I think it's definitely some similarities there.
All right, so I'll just give you a moment. Any concluding remarks from either of you?
The other existential threat is killer robots, fully autonomous weapons. You could throw that in with climate change and nuclear weapons as well. That's another big challenge for humanitarian disarmament right now. We have a campaign to stop killer robots, and they're not too far down the path either.
It's quite interesting to see these, Trump and Putin, making all these threats with nuclear weapons, North Korea developing nuclear weapons, where these are weapons from the past, developed in the 1940s. And that's not really where, we see a very strong trend in the military going a completely different direction. Mm-hmm. That's where we need to focus as well. Nuclear weapons are old-fashioned weapons that aren't actually that practical for them. Yeah. They're not very usable even. And it's probably distracting us from both keeping an eye on what's being developed right now, but also, allowing our military to actually develop the kind of defense that we need in the 21st century to combat the threats of climate change, organized crime, terrorism, food security, the kind of things that are actually threatening people today, that we are wasting all this time and resources on things that aren't protecting us, meaning that we leave ourselves vulnerable for the things that are actually threatening us. So yeah, there's a lot of issues on the agenda that we're losing out by not addressing these other weapons that we should.
And then just a reminder that same time, same place tomorrow, we'll deal with some of these other topics, the fully autonomous, environment, arms trade, and,
Explosive
Thank you.
weapons.
Explosive weapons. Sorry, Laura. So thank you all, and thank you to the panelists for coming.
Thank you.